The problem with privilege. It's your girl, Keeley Taverner, psychotherapist, passionate about helping empaths navigate complex, tricky, give you all, get nothing back in return relationships. I wanted to take this moment to talk about privilege. This is a particular issue that I see occurring more and more and more. I want to take an opportunity for people to just ponder upon this point. Yes, you may come from a privileged background. You may be privileged in terms of education. You may have been privileged in terms of the area that you lived, the holidays that you had, the extracurricular activities that you were able to pursue. However, don't assume that privilege means that you were privileged psychologically and emotionally, because often there may have been dynamics and issues within your family of origin. Now, if this video speaks to you, give me a heart, a like. If you've got a question, feel free to post it below. But this is something that keeps reoccurring again and again and again. And sometimes it feels like sometimes privileged people have a kind of uncomfortableness about talking about the difficulties in their life because they're privileged. Let's be frank, if you're from a not so privileged background, it makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you're familiar with it. If you're not, have a Google. You know, when you come from the lowest stratas of society, you are generally trying to make sure you've got food and water and shelter. Like, the basics have to be covered. If you're born into a privileged background, that is not an issue. That is covered. We also know you may have the opportunity to go to boarding school, private education, extracurricular activities, private tutors, and so on. And whilst that can give you a privilege, maybe from a professional perspective, let's not naturally assume that that means you are privileged emotionally and psychologically. In addition, let's not assume because you come from a two-parent family that you are privileged, because sometimes our parents' relationships has not necessarily been healthy. In addition, I did a recent video about the problem with outcomes, and often, not all the time, but for some children who grow up in privileged homes, there can be a need and a push, an assertion for them to deliver high grades, high achievement, so they can, honor the family, be successful. And that can sometimes create a heavy weight on individuals. So again, let's not assume privileged means privileged psychologically and emotionally. Secondly, I think it's important to also say that we need to think about our families in terms of attachment styles. Now, you might need to understand what your own attachment style is. And if that is the case, feel free, send me a message, and I'm going to encourage you to take a small test to get some insights about your own attachment style. We know that idealistically, it's helpful if you come from a secure background. But we also know it doesn't necessarily mean because you grew up in a two-parent home that you should necessarily be secure. Suppose you were chastised and humiliated. Suppose, for example, you grew up in a family where logic was valued, the sciences were valued, but you're a natural creative. For some people who are from those backgrounds, they suppress, push down, ignore their creative aspect in order to do what is acceptable to the family. So again, another reason why coming from a privileged background doesn't necessarily equal privileged emotionally and psychologically. Thirdly, for example, this often shows up for people who are from privileged backgrounds who've boarded. If you don't know, there's also a syndrome, not a word I'm always comfortable with, but let's just work with it. The boarding school syndrome, which is about sensitive children who have to go on board, who desperately miss their families, are not comfortable being in boarding school environments and who suffered tremendously. Remember, if you're in a boarding school and you are experiencing yearning, longing for your family, you have to learn over time to suppress those emotions, because the reality is you've been sent there for a reason. And so that can, in some instances, not in all cases, create further anxiety and a disassociation from one's feelings in order to present as being okay, because that is what is needed, what will mean that you're regarded as being acceptable. Actually, I was going to use a different term, that's why I've stammered there. It's about conditions of worth. So this links back to Rogerian psychotherapy, which is what I have done my master's in, which is about conditions of worth, is about your parents will love you based on you fulfilling certain conditions. And if a child doesn't fulfill those conditions, the love is withdrawn. And so naturally what happens to all kids across all classes and backgrounds, privileged or not, is that we then end up attuning to the activities, experience that get us valued from parents. And what can often happen, depending on your household, is the more you pursue what pleases them, you can end up detaching from your own authentic self. And this is how you end up on the phone with Key saying, Key, I don't know who I am anymore. And that's absolutely okay. My ambition is to help people understand how they've become split from their authentic self. And in some instances, I may, at time, and I do this deliberately and make clients aware of this, give them permission to begin to ponder upon the activities, the delights of their hearts as a child, and then encourage them to think about, well, what might you be able to do about pursuing that particular gift on your terms? Your parents, for maybe good reason, they didn't want you to explore the creative side of your identity. They also wanted they valued science, they valued logic. And so naturally, because they wanted you to be in the best position, they encouraged you to pursue those pursuits, but that may well have been out of sync with your natural, authentic nature. And now, as an adult, it may be your time to give you permission to yourself, to the aspects of self that were neglected. I hope this video speaks to someone who sometimes may feel uncomfortable about the fact that they come from a privileged background and are suffering emotionally and psychologically. It's absolutely okay. You may have been privileged in terms of education, location, and opportunity, but that does not equate to psychological and emotional privilege. And if you are battling and you're cruel and you chastise yourself and you've got a very harsh inner critic, often that is also something to ponder upon. Did you have a critical parent? If you didn't achieve the grades or do what was acceptable to your family of origin, I'd be curious to understand what would have been your experience. In addition, boarding school syndrome is a very fascinating topic. And if you have not heard of that, feel free to Google around, because there are some schools of thought that actually boarding school syndrome and boarding school experience can create a breeding ground for individuals with narcissistic traits. Again, if you disassociate from your feelings, you only become very ruthless about achieving outcomes that get you valued. I can see how that begins to make sense. But again, as someone who is here for my empath community, I'm curious about children who boarded, who struggled psychologically and emotionally, and who have become detached from their own authentic nature. My name is Keeley Taverner. I'm a psychotherapist and passionate about helping empaths understand themselves at a greater level so they can begin to take steps to pursue a good, great, authentic life. Do take care of you, because if you don't, no one is coming to save you. You must learn to save your precious self.